Trooper A1, The Purple Blitzkrieg by Gabrielle Marie Kozak. Book 1 of the Trooper series. Narrated by the author. Chapter 14. Having called the cops and given them a rundown of what she'd overheard, Julia made her way back into the main partition of the restaurant, glancing over at the table in the corner. Her face fell. The two men were gone. Julia's eyes flew across the restaurant. Had someone warned the plotters that she was calling the police? But it was too late to retract the call now, and so Julia forced herself to return to the kitchen while keeping her ears open and eyes peeled for signs of the police, and tried to ignore the sinking feeling that they'd call the whole thing a prank. It didn't take too long, as it was only a few minutes before she heard sirens and saw red and blue lights flashing at the windows. The car came to a stop directly outside the restaurant. Customers stared, and one of the waiters ran for the manager, who was upstairs. Julia merely watched out of the corner of her eye as she stirred a pot of spaghetti vigorously. She smiled slightly as she realized that she was the one and only person who knew why the police were here and who had called them. It was a strange feeling, and she had never called the police before. The manager of the restaurant, a short, stocky Italian, made his grand entrance just when the police, two of them, walked in through the fancy front doors. But he didn't seem to notice the police at first, but only the black and brown dog which trotted in energetically before them. His face grew dark. "No dogs in here," he hissed at the hapless employees who happened to be within hissing range, including Julia. "Whose dog is this? Get it out of here." "Hey, sir, it's mine," one of the policemen broke in. "Rocky, out," Derek Lassick added calmly, making a quick gesture to the dog. The manager tensed visibly when he saw the policemen and immediately became docile and more polite. "Hello, what brings you here?" he asked in his thick Italian accent. "Someone made a call," Derek told him quietly. "Some customers here are talking about an army and a war." "Customers?" A vehement hand gesture. "Nah, I have good customers here," the manager added proudly. "They left," Julia ventured, popping out of the kitchen and wiping her hands on her apron. All eyes swerved to her. "What?" "They were sitting there," the Italian 22-year-old answered, pointing to the table. "I overheard part of the conversation and called you. When I got back out here, they were gone." She shrugged. "Well, there isn't much we can do about it," Derek pointed out dryly. "Do you have a description?" "Yeah." Julia looked around at everyone in the crowded restaurant. "You want it here?" No. Derek shook his head. He looked at the manager. "Sir, do you have a back room somewhere where we can discuss this?" "Sure," the man nodded. "Come right this way." "Sorry for the trouble, sir," Derek told the manager a few minutes later as they went into the main partition of the restaurant. He touched the brim of his police force cap lightly and turned to leave. Julia had briefed the officers on everything, and they'd even collected fingerprints. If either of the two patrons were on the criminal record, the police would find out who they were. There was a moment of silence after the door closed, while the other restaurant customers stared for a bit and went back to their meals. The silence didn't last long, however. The manager was furious, though he had managed to hide it while the police were there. "You called them!" he spluttered at Julia. "Do you want to ruin my business?" Julia dropped her gaze to the floor. This was bad. Who had warned the men? "No," she replied, her voice raising automatically. "But if you hear people talking terrorism, you call the police." "You were spying on my customers?" The manager's voice rose to its highest pitch, making him sound almost hysterical. "My restaurant will never live this down. I don't care what they were talking about. You can talk to me first, and obviously you're making things up. Miss Pervitito," he mimicked her stutter mockingly. Julia flared up instantly. "No, I quit," she yelled before he could finish the sentence. "And I quit now," she finished, waving her arms furiously. There was more stunned silence from everyone else around, but the manager didn't lose a beat. "Then get out now," he roared without flinching. "I am," came the angry retort. Julia tore off the restaurant logo apron, tossed it onto one of the empty tables, and flounced out. That evening, Wednesday night, when Moira and Victoria came home with Adrian from the airport, the two parents went up to their room to talk. Moira was left alone downstairs. She had no appetite for homework and threw herself on the sofa, wondering whether to cry or go to sleep. Homework was terrible. Falling asleep would be terrible. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. Everything was all so unreal and terrible. It reminded her of when Ricky had died 3 years before. She and Connor had been 13. Adrian worked in Washington back then, too. Connor and Ricky had elected to go on a walk, and Moira and Victoria had stayed home to make dinner together. That had been fun, until the phone rang with the crushing, devastating news. The weeks after that were all blurry. Life had been shattered. But somehow, little by little, the Whites had learned how to live again. Connor's traumatic nightmares had gotten fewer and fewer. They had sewn their lives back together and become a normal family again. And now Connor, too? It wasn't fair. It couldn't be real. Connor had to be fine. He was just stuck somewhere. He wasn't dead. No way, he wasn't. He couldn't be. It was impossible. She couldn't live without her twin. She bit her lips so hard she could taste blood and stared at the ceiling, trying to slow the avalanche of panicked thoughts. Then she looked down. On the coffee table in front of her was the newspaper Connor had been reading last Thursday, almost a week ago. Distracted, she picked it up and flipped through the pages. The untimely death of some famous actor was bewailed by the headlines. There followed a few pages of various reports, including one on global warming, another on some interesting specimens of food poisoning, and more. Moira merely scanned them all until she came to the report on the bank robbery. She had read it on Thursday. Now she read it again and tried to follow the thought process Connor must have taken. Being his twin, it wasn't all that hard. He must have decided to keep his eyes out for the color he'd seen the gangsters wearing. Maybe he had seen it, and that had led him to the gun shop. And there something had happened. How he'd gotten from the gun shop to the waterfront she had no idea, but that's how it appeared. And from what she'd gathered from her mother, the police were of the mind that someone had killed him there and thrown the body into the river. No one would find it. She suddenly realized with a burst of shock that the message to her could have been typed by someone else. The police had found other fingerprints on the phone, but no, she dismissed that thought almost immediately. The phrasing, punctuated by periods, that was intrinsically Connor, she could tell, as well as the meticulously careful spelling. So the message was from him. Of that she was certain. Moira read the description again, and this time the urge to investigate herself was stronger. A wave of recklessness passed over her. Tall, dark gray clothes. I can manage that, she breathed aloud, and suddenly paused, drawing her breath in swiftly as she remembered a conversation she had had before. She and Connor, 2 months after the first bank robbery. They'd decided to find the robbers. The decision had only lasted 2 hours of running around Annapolis together and pointing out people wearing dark clothes. There had been a brief bit of excitement when they'd found someone who was wearing a mask as well, but it had been some kid who was playing a game with his sisters. That was Jack. His family had just moved to Annapolis, and that encounter had knit the beginnings of a close relationship between their families. Because Nina had quickly detected that the twins were lost, and she, Jack, and Chloe had walked home with them. But Connor had been careful to let Moira know exactly what color they were looking for. They had phones then, and he'd found what he decided was the closest thing to it on a color selector. But that's in the purple range, Moira had objected. Connor had shrugged. That's the closest I can get, he'd told her. And now that I think about it, there was the slightest hint of purple. Or violet. I don't know. So it was purple they were looking for. Or violet, the memory reminded her. Her jaw was hard and set.